Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler, and the focus is Jacksonian Conflict. The year is 1831. Tyler is serving in the United States Senate. It's a couple of years into the first term of Andrew Jackson, and Tyler and Jackson were actually aligned on most policy decisions. They were both against federally funded internal improvements, against the Bank of the United States, pro-states' rights. Personally, they could not have been more different. Tyler, the epitome of the Southern gentleman, rarely held grudges even though he was in conflict quite a bit at the time. Jackson, on the other hand, was caustic, aggressive. He held grudges on almost everything. They could not have been more different personally, but ideologically, they had a lot of alignment. The problem was, in Tyler's mind, that Jackson continued to push the envelope on presidential power, often resorting to the ends justify the means to get what he wanted, and the conflict between Tyler and Jackson continued to grow. Tyler was a constitutional stickler. In fact, there was nothing too small for him to agitate around. If there was a violation of the Constitution, he was going to go after it, including pretty small things to other people. They were not small to him. One example, Jackson at one point made a recess appointment when Congress was out for commissioners to Turkey. When Congress came back, he should have nominated them per custom at the time for a formal nomination, and he did not. So Tyler said, we got to hold him accountable. Let us meet this question boldly and fearlessly. Let us tell the president he has erred. Let us be true to ourselves, to our constituents, but above all to the Constitution, even on this relatively minor matter. Similarly, Tyler was concerned about a lot of the appointments Jackson was making to members of the press. He thought this was trying to curry favor with the press. This could be a bad precedent. So these were some of the maybe smaller things, but again, they weren't that small to John Tyler. Then there were the big stuff. Things like the tariff and the Nullification Crisis that was about to happen, the Bank of the United States and that crisis about to happen. Andrew Jackson and John Tyler on diametrically opposed sides in the end, even though there were kernels of these policies from Jackson that Tyler actually supported. So let's start with the tariff. 1828, Tyler had just gotten to the Senate, this was a couple years before, when a large protective tariff was passed. And the South hated this, they thought it was unfair, they believed it was unconstitutional, they called it the Tariff of Abominations. 1832, they were trying to come up with something that would appease the South, but the tariff update that passed in 32 was not nearly enough to appease their interests. And right after Jackson was reelected in 1832, the state of South Carolina, led by Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun, got together in convention and declared that the tariffs of the national tariffs to be unlawful. They were nullifying these statutes, these federal statutes, within their own boundaries. This Nullification Proclamation came out December 1832, and Andrew Jackson was ready for it. Jackson was pro-states' rights, like a John Tyler, but he drew a line, only to a point. Anywhere where the state is trying to actually usurp the authority of the federal government by something like this, declaring a federal law unconstitutional or illegal or nullify it, he simply drew that line. He thought that was an attack on the Union, and while he was pro-states' rights, that only went so far. Jackson almost immediately issued his own Nullification Proclamation, in which he said, I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. There was no question where Andrew Jackson stood on this topic. There was also no question where John Tyler stood on this topic. He was states' rights, pro-states' rights, but with no caveats to them, even maybe more than his idol Thomas Jefferson was. Jefferson was the one who was sort of the father of nullification. He had written the Kentucky Resolution back in 1798 to basically nullify the alien and sedition laws that were passed under President John Adams in the state of Kentucky. Now, not much came of that because Virginia was the only other state that sort of signed on to this theory, but the idea was that states' rights predominate to the point of nullification or potentially even secession. This was Jefferson's view, and John Tyler was a subscriber to that perspective. Tyler made his perspective very, very clear in the following statement. According to Tyler, the government created by the states is amenable to the states, is preserved by the states, and may be destroyed by the states. The federal government holds its existence at the pleasure of these states. The true state of the case is this. It is because I owe allegiance to the state of Virginia that I owe obedience to the laws of this federal government. My state requires me to render such obedience. She has entered into a compact, which, while it continues, is binding on all her people. So would it be if she had formed a treaty with a foreign power? I should be bound to obey the stipulation of such treaty because she willed it. It is because I owe allegiance there that I owe obedience here. I owe no responsibility, politically speaking, elsewhere than to my state. This was as strong a pro-states' rights perspective as any president, maybe even a Jefferson, would have said, and Tyler's saying it here in 1832 as a member of the United States Senate. Well, conflict was happening, so how were they going to get out from under this? Andrew Jackson was ready to use force. He was working with Congress to pass a force bill to give him military authority to go send in troops and enforce that federal law in the state of South Carolina. Again, this was anathema to John Tyler. He wrote to the governor of Virginia, John Floyd, at the time, that if South Carolina be put down, then may each of the states yield all pretensions to sovereignty. We have a consolidated government, and a master will soon arise. This is inevitable. How idle to talk of preserving a republic for any length of time with an uncontrolled power over the military exercised at pleasure by the president. Fortunately, a crisis was averted, and Tyler had a role in it. Tyler joined the likes of Henry Clay and John Calhoun working behind the scenes in Congress while the force bill was making its way through to come up with a new tariff bill. And eventually, Andrew Jackson signed both into law. The force bill was unnecessary because the new tariff bill did get South Carolina to stand down. It would gradually reduce those tariff rates to a level that was acceptable to them. The crisis was averted as the nullification ordinance was withdrawn. Tyler's pretty happy. He was happy that South Carolina was not invaded by the federal government and states' rights still sort of had a very strong say in this. And he was happy that he had a role in working this compromise tariff behind the scenes, something that he was very proud of. Well, at the same time, there's the battle over the Bank of the United States. This one goes back to the very beginning of the Republic under President George Washington, when Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, were basically in an ideological battle over things like this bank. Could the federal government establish a national bank? That was the constitutional question. And was it good policy? According to Hamilton, yes, I've got the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution that gives me the authority to do this, and it's going to be good for the economic stability and long-term health of the economy of the country. Jefferson says, no, you can't use the necessary and proper clause for this, because if you did, then you could basically pass any law in the federal government. This is not constitutional, and it's bad policy because it's putting power into the hands of the central government, which again was against his political point of view. Well, in this case, Andrew Jackson and John Tyler were completely aligned. They were against the Bank of the United States. Unconstitutional, bad policy, too much power in the hands of these unelected money men. And so Tyler supported President Jackson in 1832 when he vetoed the bill to recharter the Bank of the United States. But then things changed. In Jackson's second term, very early in his second term, the bank still had 4 years left on its existing charter, but Jackson didn't want to wait. He wanted to accelerate its demise. So he put a plan in place to just take all the money out. All the federal funds that were in the Bank of the United States, Jackson was going to withdraw them and put them into some state banks where he felt that would be better for the overall sake of the economy and the country. Well, John Tyler had significant concerns with this, as did many people in Congress and, in fact, in the cabinet of Andrew Jackson. According to Tyler, this was illegal. It was done without the approval of Congress, which he thought was necessary. He thought it potentially violated the contract with the Bank of the United States, which still had 4 years to go in its charter. He thought it was a bad process, hand-picking these pet banks that they called them, the pets of the president, picking winners and losers of individual state banks. That wasn't right in his mind. He basically felt that the president overstepped his authority. According to John Tyler, that if I have been reared in an abhorrence of arbitrary power, and whether exerted by the imperial monarch on his throne, surrounded by his myrmidons, or by an official agent in our free republics, that feeling still predominates. I conclude then that the Treasury Secretary had no authority under the law to have acted as he has done, and that he has therefore been guilty of a flagrant assumption of power. Well, Andrew Jackson did it anyway. He took the money out, put it in his pet banks, and Congress was unable to stop him. Congress did take a step. They proposed censure in the Senate against the President of the United States. Now, the state of Virginia was supportive of this censure, and they instructed their senators, John Tyler being one, to vote in favor of the censure. John Tyler had no problem with this because he thought the president had overreached, and he did vote, and that censure of Jackson passed. But that was not the end of the story. Jackson's supporters in the Senate, led by Senator Thomas Benton of Missouri, tried throughout the rest of his term to get that censure expunged. Toward the very end of his term, it's now 1837, his successor has already been voted into office. He's going to be leaving office very soon, and that vote is coming up again to try to expunge the censure of Jackson in the Senate. In the meantime, the state of Virginia state legislature had turned over. And now more Jacksonian supporters were there, and their instructions to their state senators were to vote in favor of removing the censure. And this put John Tyler in a really tough spot. He was conflicted in part because he still believed in the censure. He had voted for it. He didn't think anything had changed, so there was no reason to change his vote. But on the other hand, part of his Republican principle was that he was there as an appointed representative of the state. He was representing the state in the United States Senate, not himself, and he always believed that senators needed to follow the instructions of the state legislature. So what was he going to do? In the end, the highly principled John Tyler had only one choice, and that was to resign. He said that in his resignation, February 15th, 1836, "My resolution is fixed and I shall resign. I cannot look to consequences, but perhaps I am doomed to perpetual exile from the public councils. If so, I am content, nor should I repine at it." Well, the censure was formally removed in January of 1837. The principal John Tyler was not there for it. He was already now a private citizen, again back in the state of Virginia, but he wasn't going to be there long. He was not going to be doomed to perpetual exile from the public councils, but that is the story for another day. That is John Tyler and Jacksonian Conflict from the life of John Tyler. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.